introduction. Welcome everybody, I'm so happy to see you all. Yesterday was a very stormy day, so several people arrived here after a rather adventurous flight. So for all of you who did, thank you for going through that to be here. Just one thing, this is, so if, Julia already showed you, if you are into social media and all that kind of stuff, this is all the information you need for that. But more importantly, Wi-Fi, the most basic need in life, is over there in case you missed it. And it's a very simple password, 1, 2, 3, etc. until 9 and then 0. Yeah, so for those of you who are wondering. All right, so I've been asked, or we didn't want to have too many plenaries during this conference, but we did want to have a plenary to kind of give an overview of what is it that we did in this Transit project. So the challenge for me in the next 30 minutes will be to tell you what happened in 3.5 years in less than 30 minutes. And I will focus first on explaining what we mean by transformative social innovation, how have we conceptualized and theorized it. What were the cases that we looked at and what were the methods that we used? And I also want to talk about the hybrid and political nature of this phenomena. So throughout the talk there will be several references to that. So to dive right into it, social innovation is a term that has been defined in the literature and several fields of research in many different ways. We build on all these different dimensions and we integrate it into our definition, which is that it's a change in social relations involving new ways of doing, new ways of knowing, new ways of framing, and new ways of organizing. So to take an example to illustrate this, if you take the example of community energy, the phenomena that people are producing their own energy, often at a local scale. Obviously, technological innovation is also very important here. Without the windmills, without the solar panels, there would be no community energy. However, we argue that it's also socially innovative in the sense that this involves changing social relations between neighbors, but also between consumers and producers, and between citizens and their local governments. And these new relations also come with new practices, like going to the roof with your neighbors to attend to your solar panels. But this also requires new knowledge on how to do that and how to produce the energy. It also comes with new ways of framing, like the term community energy, but also entirely new words like the prosumer, which is a combination of a consumer and a producer in one. And it also comes with reinventing and rediscovering organizational models, such as the cooperative. And here I very consciously use the word reinventing, because as many of us know, there is absolutely nothing new about the cooperative. It has existed for many centuries. But what you do see is that in recent years there has been a revival and a rediscovery of the cooperative, partly in response to the economic crisis. So what you see is social innovation is not necessarily about new things, and this is a very important thing to emphasize. It's also about reviving and rediscovering old things and recombining them in new contexts. And you see this same dynamic with complementary currencies, the phenomena that people have their own local money, and again, local exchange trading systems have existed for many decades. But what is new is that in recent years you see that people combine it with mobile technologies, such as the Brixton pound in London that you can pay with your mobile app, or in Bristol where they did this experiment where they allowed citizens to pay the local taxes with the local Bristol pound. So these are just a few examples. There are many, many more, which you will hear much about the coming 2 days. And if you look at this bewildering amount of social innovations around, then it raises all sorts of questions, like how do they relate to each other, and also what's their impact. And this is not just a question that researchers ask, it's also something that the people working on those innovations themselves wonder about. You know, what does this lead to? Now, in the meantime, we all know we have several global societal challenges that are all interrelated, from climate change, natural disasters, wildfires, floods, the economic crisis, all sorts of geopolitical tensions, the immigration issues. So there is an increasing amount of societal challenges that are interlinked and systemic, and governments around the world at local, national, international level are struggling to deal with these challenges. especially nowadays that we have the economic austerity and budget cuts, which makes it even more difficult to deal with these challenges. So in this situation, when you have all that social innovation and all these societal challenges, logically and obviously it raises this expectation that maybe these social innovations can help deal with these challenges. And you see that these expectations of social innovation are increasingly also present in all sorts of policy discourses. You see that especially in the European Union, when, for instance, already the former EU Commission President, José Manuel Barroso, already emphasized that if encouraged and valued, social innovation can bring immediate solutions to the pressing social issues that citizens are confronted with. And the influential Bureau for European Policy Advisors will also emphasize that social innovation can be a response in times of major budgetary constraints. So as a result of these kind of expectations, you see that there is quite some policy attention to social innovation, which of course comes with all sorts of reports and programs and also lots of subsidies. So as a result of that, there have been lots of social innovation projects, and this is not comprehensive at all. There's many more. I didn't manage to put all of them on one slide, and the Transit project is just one of them. So what is it that makes a Transit project, what distinguishes the Transit project, is particularly, and Julia already mentioned it, is our focus on the transformative aspect. Not just social innovation, but transformative social innovation. And we define this aspect of transformative social innovation in relation to the social context and the dominant institutions therein. And we argue that social innovation is transformative to the extent that it can challenge, alter, and or replace the dominant institutions in that social context. However, it's very important to emphasize that obviously the social context and also the dominant institutions therein are not static objects. They are continuously underlined, they are continuously facing change themselves. Also, these institutions are continuously in flux. There are all sorts of game changers in that context, like the economic crisis, like climate change. So it's also the social context that challenges the social innovations. So it's a continuously two-way process. And also, something to emphasize is that these dominant institutions are not the same as governments. Yeah? So when we say challenge, alter, replace governments, it's not the innovations against the governments. When we say dominant institutions, we're talking much more broadly about the dominant ways of thinking, organizing, knowing, and doing. So it's all of us. So it's also our ingrained behavior and our paradigms and our practices. So what we're particularly interested in is what is the agency for such transformative social innovation? So how are people who are involved in all sorts of initiatives and networks like the ones present here, how are they empowered but also disempowered to contribute to such transformative social innovation? And of course, these are very big questions. We're not the first ones to ask this question. Social scientists and also the humanities have been thinking about this question for many centuries. So this was one of the major achievements of the Transit project, was to really build on a lot of different perspective, concepts and notions, and not only integrate them, but also have the debate on how they complement each other. Because it's, on the one hand, it's really very much about the individual level and the motivations of individuals, but it's also very much about the collective level within an initiative, how the group processes form. And then it's very much about the interrelations between the different initiatives, so the network formation across them. And then we have the institutional level, as well as the more social material context. So these all these different, not so much levels, but maybe more like dimensions of social innovation and transformative change. And for each of them, we build on different theories and different disciplinary traditions, ranging from institutional theory to transition research, innovation studies, but also political psychology. Now, even though these are all social sciences, they have quite different, not only different definitions and concepts, but also different understandings and different starting points of how to look at the world, both in terms of understanding, but also in terms of how do you research it. So this led to a lot of debate, a lot of heated debate, a lot of interaction, a lot of figuring out, a lot of understanding each other. And we're extremely happy that we managed to kind of integrate these different perspectives into this conceptual framework, and we formulated 20 theoretical propositions on transformative social innovation, which are all written down in several reports, deliverables, and working papers. So I'm not going to go through all these 20 propositions, but definitely some of these insights will come through. And we call it a middle range theory, because it's not just theoretical and abstract notions, but we have always engaged with what we saw in practice. So it was a continuous interaction between the concepts, the theories, and what we saw in practice in these 20 networks that Julia already mentioned. And one of the things that these have in common, and this is also how we selected them, is that they are translocal networks or transnational, meaning that on the one hand they operate at the international levels. So these are global networks. But at the same time, if you look at the initiatives, they are also very locally embedded. So it's both at the same time. One example of a local initiative that we have studied and that is also very known around the world is participatory budgeting, which started in Porto Alegre in Brazil at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, where the idea is basically, to put it very shortly, that citizens get involved in not only monitoring how the budget of their local government is spent, but also deciding and co-deciding how the budget is spent. This was a very successful initiative. It got a lot of attention. So it grew a lot around the world. And in 2012, researchers estimated that there were between 800 and 1,500 participatory budgeting initiatives across the world. And there are also networks facilitating this. We ourselves have studied the Observatorio Internacional de Democracia Participativa. And this is one of the networks that actually connects hundreds of towns and organizations and local governments around the world that want to facilitate such participatory budgeting. Another example that we have studied is the Impact Hub, which is a community of social entrepreneurs that don't only share a co-working space together, but they also explicitly collaborate with each other in order to increase their positive impact on society and to see how their independent enterprises can have a positive impact. And again, this is part of a global network where you have, I don't know if you guys can see it. Maybe we should go. There's more than 80 impact hubs around the world, more than 20 in the making. In total, there's more than 50,000 members, and in all the 5 different regions. So it's a big network that also really shares a particular way of how to collaborate. And there's a website, and there are meetings, etc. So another example of local initiatives that we studied are eco-villages. And eco-villages, again, to put it very simplistically, are places where people try to live in harmony with each other and with nature. And what they are known for around the world is being pioneers in organic agriculture, the construction of sustainable houses. This is Findhorn Eco-Village in Scotland, where they turned whiskey barrels into houses. But also, what eco-villages also do is experiment with all sorts of new decision-making methods and group-building capacity methods. So it's not just the physical, the organic, and the sustainable housing, but also very much the social aspect. And again, even though eco-villages are extremely localized phenomena, the Global Eco-Village Network connects hundreds of eco-villages across the world, bringing them together to exchange and learn from each other. And this network then has various sub-networks in each continent. So these were just a few examples. I'm not going to even try to give an overview of all of them. Mostly, not only because you have all the reports online and the websites, which we all link to, you even have a booklet in your conference thing with a short summary of each and every one of them. Most importantly, because many of the people involved in these movements are here. So, of course, they can much better tell you about these initiatives. What I do want to say a bit is how we studied them. We studied them through a so-called embedded case study approach, meaning that we looked at how they operate at the international level, so these 20 translocal networks, but then we also zoomed in to understand how the local initiatives what happens there. So for each network, we looked at 4 to 7 local initiatives, resulting in more than 100 local cases in 25 countries, mostly in Europe, Latin America, but also some other countries. And we did this not only through the usual document reviews and lots of interviews, but we also did participant observations. So our researchers went there, they were part of the activities, they engaged in a lot of the things on the ground, they visited the initiatives, etc. And then, of course, besides collecting the material, we then also analyzed and compared. And one thing that we're particularly proud of is our critical turning database, where we try to go beyond the stories that you get of initiatives and networks when you visit them for the first time or you go to the network, to really kind of try to dive behind it. Like, what are the stories behind it? How did these initiatives develop through time? And what were the critical turning points? By which we mean, which were the breakthroughs, but also the setbacks and the surprises and the frustrations and the struggles. So that's what we try to do in creating these TSI timelines, as we call them. The thing is online, our critical turning point database. You can visit it, you can click it, you can use it. We are still tweaking and perfecting it as it goes. We still have 3 months to go, but it's already online because we didn't want to wait until the end. So please go and visit our database. And we also have several papers explaining the whole methodology behind it, what was asked, etc. And then, of course, the comparative analysis, which I already mentioned. We have several reports comparing the different cases. And then we also wrote several publications and working papers specifying specific elements, like what do the different cases do about inclusive society, or what does this selection of cases do about space and place. So there's many different things that focus on specific aspects. Not going to go through all of them, but I did want to say a little bit about our work on comparing how these different initiatives and networks relate to the economic system, because many of them are critical of the economic system and have specific perspectives and narratives about alternative economies. So we call these narratives of change. People have specific perspectives on why the world needs to change, how it needs to change, and also who can change the world. And through this comparison, we found that you can distinguish 4 clusters of narratives on alternative economies. Now, obviously, each local initiative and each network has its own very specific narrative, but there are also some overlaps and some clusters that we can distinguish. So one narrative is very much about incubating social entrepreneurs, bringing them together, enabling them through hubs and co-working spaces. And in terms of an alternative economy, that's very much focused on social entrepreneurship and the so-called social economy. Another different perspective is this idea that we need to live in community, and that it's very much about not only personal lifestyle change, but also collective lifestyle change, and also really about relocalizing your consumption and production. So here you also see that the images of such networks, such as eco-villages and transition towns, are very much about, working in the ground. It's very much people being outside and living in harmony with nature. So in terms of an economy, this is much more about degrowth, or at least about relocalizing consumption and production. And then a third cluster, which is many of you know as the sharing economy. Here, it's not so much about people living in community or social entrepreneurs, but it's much more about makers and users who are redesigning and sharing goods. So it's about different ways of making goods, but also making them open and hackable, and providing all sorts of platforms that enable people to share these goods. So this is the sharing economy, or the collaborative economy. And then last but not least, we also distinguish a fourth cluster, which is much more focused on political institutional reform. The starting point is, in order to have transformative change, we need to really change the current economic and political structures. And here, in terms of economy, it's much more focused on the solidarity economy, that in order to get solidarity, we need to have these fundamental structural changes. Now, obviously, there's much overlap between these 4 clusters. Also, a lot of initiatives relate to all of them. So it's not that you can just box them as we try to do this, as we do as researchers. There's overlap, but there are also important differences, because if you look at these 4 clusters from a mainstream economic perspective, they're all kind of similar, alternative, cute, nice. But when you zoom in, they have important differences also, or different foci. So, for instance, someone from the solidarity economy movement could be critical of social entrepreneurship, arguing that the idea of social enterprise still reproduces the idea of for-profit making. Or the other way around, the social entrepreneur could argue, as long as we don't have a sustainable way of profit making and entrepreneurship, nothing is ever going to change. So there is these different perspectives. So besides the difference, so people think, it's mostly, it has to come from the private market sector, or eco-villages from the community, from civil society. But we gave you an example of participatory budgeting that was actually started by the mayor of Porto Alegre. So it was someone from within government that started this social innovation initiative. So we would argue that actually social innovation emerges from diverse institutional contexts that can come from everywhere. And more importantly, the changing relations between these different institutional contexts, that is social innovation in itself. And here it's not just about changing the relations between these different institutional contexts, it's also about challenging and changing the underlying logics of these institutional contexts and negotiating or renegotiating new and adapted ones. Because you see a lot of social innovation initiatives, they lack an evident, obvious institutional home. So our colleague Bono Pell also talks about institutional nomadism. So a lot of these initiatives are institutional nomads looking for, and this on the one hand is a barrier, and it comes with a lot of restrictions when it comes to financing, but it's also an opportunity for transformative impact, because rather than stretching and conforming to the existing, they look for hybrid organizational forms. To give one example, time banks, where the social innovation is very much about reciprocal service exchange, which is very different from our current economic system that is mostly based on service exchange through formal money transactions. And one of the many things that the time banks networks achieve, for instance, is entering this renegotiation of taxes, for instance. How do you tax reciprocal service exchange? What kind of different tax systems do you need for that? So this moment when social innovation is confronted with this institutional context and change, that's when things get really exciting, because on the one hand, this is where the transformative change can occur. But at the same time, it's also the moment that things can get captured and stifled. If you take the example of solar energy and organic products in the supermarkets, of course, many decades ago, these things were already being pioneered, back in the day when people were still thinking they were crazy and marginal. So some people would call this a story of success, because something very innovative became normal at the market and it became more accessible to more people. But other people would call it a tragedy, because it's basically an example of how something that was very innovative got captured by commercial interests. And we have the similar debate currently about the sharing economy, as many of you have probably heard, where this idea of couch surfing, where you could sleep on each other's couch all around the world for free, this idea has been translated into a very successful business model where people can, make money from this, and then also there's a company behind it that makes a lot of profit from providing the platform for doing so. So while that's not necessarily a problem in itself, there's many people who are concerned that this sharing economy, that after whitewashing and greenwashing, we now also have we-washing, where community and sharing is being commercialized and commodified. And this is not just a debate that you see around the sharing economy. There's a more general discussion about the neoliberal takeover of social entrepreneurship. Lots of people who worry about participatory budgeting being watered down. But even one of the most radical and progressive ideas, such as basic income, some people would argue that it's a neoliberal weapon or even a neoliberal plot to make you poor, in the sense that some people fear that it can be misused and is as an excuse to abolish welfare provision support. So, in conclusion, we argue that social innovations have a dialectic relation with established institutions. On the one hand, they challenge them, but they also reproduce them. To be transformative, inclusive, and accessible, some sort of mainstreaming is necessary. And this is not just about commercialization, it's also about formalizing, bureaucratizing, but also just about normalizing something. And the important thing to realize is that as such, transformative social innovation is very highly political, whether you want it or not. And you need to be prepared for these mainstreaming paradoxes. So using the Trojan horse metaphor, our colleague Bonapel emphasizes that we need a dialectical perspective on an innovation capture. So in innovation land, we often see capture as something that either we're obsessed with it and we need to upskill and we need to, or we are critical of it. But it's going to happen anyway at some point. So how do you prepare for it? And how do you make sure that in that capture you can still have transformative impact? So another of our colleagues who unfortunately couldn't be here, he argues that for successful innovation it's very important to, on the one hand, have this process of translation where these new ways of doing, knowing, framing and organizing are translated to more mainstream context, but that at the same time you need to really maintain that radical core. So it's this paradox that is one of the main challenges, because initiatives need this portfolio of very different and often paradoxical strategies where it is not just about supplementing things with alternatives, but it's also about lobbying, protesting, compromising, complying, circumventing, avoiding, seducing, negotiating, imitating, surprising, and so on. So to end with the last example, this is what I find so fascinating about, for instance, the eco-village movement, where on the one hand it's very much about your hands in the mud, growing your own food, building your own houses, but it's also about protest and activism, such as this eco-village in Portugal that organized this protest against drilling a few weeks ago. But it's also about education and capacity building and working with institutions such as the European Union or the United Nations. And it's also about lobbying. So the Global Eco-Village Network cooperates with other networks, or the European Global Eco-Village Network cooperates with other networks in the EcoLise network, which is very focused on also making the connection with policymakers. And for instance, I think in a week from now, organizing this European Day of Sustainable Communities, where it's not just about eco-villages or transition towns, but how do we get more people involved? So this is just one example of how a movement tries to use different strategies, but I think all of the networks and the initiatives that we have studied have this very smart double approach or flexible approach. So I really hope that in the coming 2 days you will share these strategies, not only the success stories, but also the struggles of how you do that. And then I would like to finish with my favorite quote of all times. Many of you already know it. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. One should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise. And I really hope that in the coming days you go away with a sense of urgency, but also really committed to make them otherwise. Thank you very much.